A dark romance series The Monster Who Owned Me Part 2. The photographs. The most terrifying thing about a cage's not the bars. It is the moment you realize you walked in because something inside you wanted to. 112 photographs. Violet, week 7, Tuesday. The folder was cream-colored. Standard. The kind of folder that lives in offices everywhere, unremarkable except for what was inside it. I found it on Nora's desk at 11:17 on a Tuesday morning, while Nora was in the corridor outside taking a call in the low, tight voice she used when she didn't want to be overheard. I'd come to drop off material cost estimates that the project architect had asked me to route through Nora's office. I set the envelope on her desk. I was turning to leave. The folder was open, not dramatically, not splayed. Just open at an angle, the casual open of something set down in a hurry, the open of someone who left the room faster than they'd expected to and didn't think to close it first. I saw my own face before I understood what I was looking at. The photograph on top was printed on matte paper, the kind used for surveillance documentation rather than personal photography. It showed me from perhaps 15 meters away, from a slightly elevated angle, a long lens, or a second-floor window. I was standing outside the coffee cart on 9th Avenue that I visited every morning, the one run by a man named Yusuf who knew my order and always gave me an extra sugar because, he said, I looked like I was carrying something heavy. I was carrying a canvas bag and a takeaway cup, and I was looking down at my phone, and I had absolutely no idea I was being photographed. The timestamp in the lower right corner said, October 14, 3 weeks before the party at the Meridian. 3 weeks before I had pressed the wrong elevator button and walked into Adrian Kane's orbit and had my life rearranged. I stood at Nora's desk and looked at the photograph for 1 full second. Then, with the particular clarity that comes when something you've half suspected becomes undeniable, I lifted the top photograph. There were 12 in total. Me outside my apartment building. Me at the gallery opening in Chelsea. I'd attended the 2nd week of October. I could see the exhibition banner in the background, Threshold. New Works, the show I'd gone to alone on a Wednesday evening because I'd needed to see other people's work to shake me out of a creative block. Me on the High Line, sitting on a bench, sketching. Me at the RISD alumni reception I'd gone to on October 22nd, 5 days before the Meridian party. Me at the Hartwell Foundation event. On the 38th floor. The floor I'd supposedly been headed to by accident. The timestamp on that one said, October 27, 8:41 p.m. 12 minutes before the Meridian party had begun on the 39th floor. 12 minutes before I had stepped into the wrong elevator, pressed the wrong button, walked into the wrong room. I looked at the photographs for 30 seconds of a world reorganizing itself around new information, the particular vertigo of understanding you've been inside someone else's plan without knowing it. Then I heard Nora's voice in the corridor, winding down her call. I put the photographs back exactly as I'd found them. I walked to the door. I passed Nora in the corridor, exchanged a pleasantry about the material estimates, and returned to my studio with steady hands and a heart doing something arrhythmic and violent in my chest. I sat at my workbench. I looked at the city through the window, and I thought with absolute precision, there was no wrong floor. There has never been a wrong floor. He chose me. He watched me. He arranged the collision and called it chance. The question was not whether this was true. It was true. The photographs were proof. The timestamps were proof. The fact of his reply at 3:19 in the morning to a contract he'd already decided I'd sign was proof. The question was what I was going to do with it. I worked until 4 o'clock. Not because I could concentrate. I couldn't, not really. My hands moving through the familiar motions of the work, while my mind turned the photographs over and over like a stone, with something written on the underside I couldn't quite read. But because stopping felt like surrendering the only ground I had, and I was not ready to do that yet. At 4:15, I heard his footsteps in the corridor. I'd learned the sound of them in 7 weeks, the unhurried, evenly paced footfall of someone who moves through spaces as if the spaces belong to him, which they did. I'd learned to tell the difference between the footsteps that stopped at my door and the ones that continued past, and these ones stopped. The knock was his 2 precise raps, not a request but an announcement. "Come in," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. He came in. He was in his usual late afternoon configuration, jacket still on, collar still closed, because Adrian Kane did not unbend visually in professional spaces, and he carried the particular focused energy of someone who had spent the day making decisions that cost other people sleep. He looked at the work I'd laid out. He looked at me. "Tense," he said, not a question. "Long day," I said. He moved to the window, his habitual position, the place he defaulted to in my studio the way other people defaulted to chairs, and stood with his hands in his pockets looking out at the city, and the light was low and gold and the room was very quiet. "The glass installation mock-up," he said. "The east quadrant isn't reading right." "I know. I'm reworking the suspension angles." "What's the problem?" "The problem," I said, and I set down the tool I was holding and turned to face him fully, "is that I've been lied to." Room changed. It didn't change visibly. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't do any of the things bodies do when they're caught. But something in the quality of the air between us altered, tightened, the way a wire tightens before it breaks, and I felt it the way I always felt changes in this room's atmosphere, in my skin before my brain. He turned from the window, his face was controlled. Of course it was controlled. This was a man whose face had been controlled for so long that the control had become structural, load-bearing. "About what?" he said. "About how we met," I said. Chapter 2, what he says when there is no defense. Violet, the silence lasted 6 seconds. I counted. In 6 seconds, I watched something work its way through Adrian Kane's expression. Not panic, not guilt in any form I recognized, but a more complicated thing. The specific quality of a man who has been prepared for a confrontation he knew was coming and is now assessing the gap between his preparation and reality. "Explain," he said, one word. Quiet. Not a deflection, an invitation, or a test. "I saw Nora's desk this morning, the folder, the photographs." I kept my voice even. 12 of them, taken over the 2 weeks before the Meridian party. Me, my building, my coffee cart, the gallery opening, the high line, time-stamped. A pause. The last one was taken at the Hartwell Foundation event, the 38th floor, the floor I was supposedly on my way to when I accidentally walked into yours. He didn't look away. His eyes stayed on mine with the same steady focus they always held, that particular quality of attention that was never quite comfortable and always compelling, the gaze of someone who has decided that the thing in front of them is worth the full measure of their concentration. "I see," he said. "That's all you have." I said. "I see. What would you like me to say?" "I'd like you to tell me the truth. I'd like you to explain why you had me followed for 2 weeks before we accidentally met. I'd like you to explain how a man who controls everything in a room at all times managed to arrange a meeting that he then presented as coincidence." My voice was steady. I had not raised it. I was aware that not raising it was a choice I was making deliberately, because the alternative was something I wasn't ready to perform in front of him. "I'd like to know what you wanted from me before you knew me. And I'd like to know whether any of this, the studio, the commission, the contract, was real. Or whether I am simply another acquisition." The last word hit the air between us with more weight than I'd intended. Something moved across his face, fast, uncontrolled, gone before I could name it. The most unguarded thing I'd seen from him. The briefest crack in the architecture, he walked toward me, not aggressively, not in the way of someone trying to intimidate, but steadily, with the deliberate movement of a person who has decided to close a distance, and he stopped 3 feet away from me, closer than he'd ever stood when it was just the two of us, and looked at me with an expression I didn't have a category for yet. "I saw your work in March." He said, "I stood in front of it for 11 minutes. I've been in hundreds of galleries. Nothing has ever stopped me for 11 minutes. I said nothing. "I had you researched," he said. "The way I research everything that interests me, it's not surveillance, it's due diligence." "Photographing someone outside their apartment is surveillance," I said. "Not due diligence." A beat. "You're right." Admission was so unexpected that I went briefly still. "Photographs were taken by a security contractor," he said. "I asked for a professional background assessment. What I received was more extensive than I requested." He held my gaze. "I should have reviewed the scope of the work before it was carried out. I didn't. That is a failure of oversight on my part, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "The party," I said. "The wrong floor." Another pause, shorter than the last, but present. "Hartwell Foundation is one of my charitable subsidiaries," he said. "I knew you'd received an invitation to their event. I knew it was the same evening as my private dinner. I knew the elevator bank services both floors. You arranged for me to press the wrong button." I arranged for the button panel on the elevator you were most likely to use to have a slight delay on the 38th floor selection, he said. Most people in that circumstance press the next available illuminated floor. I stared at him. You engineered a malfunction, I said, in an elevator to accidentally on purpose put me in your party. He said. That is insane, I said. It is, he agreed. It is also, in retrospect, one of the less defensible things I've done. Retrospect, I repeated. What was it at the time? The look on his face was the closest thing to complicated I'd ever seen from him, something layered and difficult, the face of a man unaccustomed to explaining his own interiority because he has never found it necessary before. At the time, he said, it was the only method I could identify for meeting you that didn't require me to approach you directly. I opened my mouth, closed it. You could have approached me directly, I said. At the gallery, at any point. You're Adrian Kane. People do not generally refuse to meet you, he said. They don't. Why? Because I didn't want to be Adrian Kane when I met you, he said. The room was very quiet. I didn't want to be the person who walks into rooms and changes their air pressure. I didn't want you to meet me as a category before you met me as a person. I wanted. He stopped. His jaw tightened fractionally. I wanted one conversation that started without the weight of everything I am. I looked at him for a long moment. And do you think, I said carefully, that engineering a fake accidental meeting accomplished that? A pause. No, he said. In retrospect, I think it accomplished the opposite. Because now I'm standing here having this conversation instead of any other conversation. We looked at each other across 3 feet of studio floor. I should leave, I said. You should, he said. If that's what you want. What I want, I said, is to think. Then think, he said. The contract stands regardless. The commission is real. The work is real. Everything I've told you about the project is true. His voice was even. The method of getting you here was wrong. Everything after you arrived has been honest. I picked up my bag. I walked to the door. At the threshold, I stopped. I didn't turn around. Woman named Alina, I said. Who was she? The silence behind me was different from his other silences. Heavier. The kind of silence that has mass. Someone who was also in this building, he said. A long time ago. What happened to her? The pause was so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. She left, he said. Something in the way he said it, 2 words, the past tense of something much larger, made me not press further. Not tonight. Tonight I had enough. I walked out. I took the elevator down. I stepped onto the street into the November dark, and the cold hit me like a clarification, and I stood on the sidewalk outside Kane Tower and looked up at the building, all 42 floors, the lit and the dark, the known and the unknown, and I breathed. He had watched me. He had engineered our meeting. He had lied by omission about every element of how we'd come to be in the same room, and then he had told the truth. Plainly, without deflection, without the performance of remorse that would have felt worse than the admission itself. He'd said I was wrong, and it is what it is, and everything after is honest with the particular economy of someone who doesn't bother prettying up the things that can't be prettied up. I stood outside for 4 minutes. Then I went home. I did not quit. I would examine that fact later at length, and still not fully understand it. But the truth, and I've never been able to pretend otherwise, not even to myself, was that the revelation had not made him less. It had, inexplicably and infuriatingly, made him more. The man who had engineered an elevator malfunction because he couldn't figure out how to have a normal conversation was more human than the man who controlled every room he entered. The man who said I wanted one conversation that started without the weight of everything I am was someone I understood. In the way you understand things that speak to something you've also felt, but never had the words for. I went home, and I lay in the dark and I thought about it, and I reached no useful conclusion. And at 3 a.m. I got up and sketched for 2 hours, because it was the only way to move the things that had nowhere else to go. In the morning I went back. Chapter 3, The Architecture of Proximity, Violet. The following week something shifted after the photographs. Not dramatically. Not with the clean resolution of a confrontation that settles things. More like the shift you feel in a room after a window has been opened. The same room, the same furniture, the same dimensions, but the air is different now, moving differently, carrying things in that it didn't carry before. He came to the studio more often. Not every day, that would have been too obvious, and Adrian Kane did not do obvious. But the 2 to 3 day intervals compressed, and when he came, he stayed longer. The 15-minute limit he'd maintained with such discipline in the early weeks stretched to 20, to 30, to an afternoon in the 4th week after the photographs, where we sat at my workbench for 2 hours going over the atrium installation plans in a way that stopped being about the installation somewhere around the 90-minute mark and became something else. A conversation, real and open, the kind that wanders and doubles back and goes somewhere neither person planned. He told me about the building. Not Kane Tower, his first building, the one he'd bought at 26 with borrowed money and sheer will, a converted warehouse in Red Hook that had taken 3 years to renovate and had taught him, he said, everything he'd ever needed to know about the relationship between space and power. Every room sends a message, he said. Most people don't think about it consciously, but they feel it. The ceiling height, the light source, the distance between where you stand and where you're supposed to stand. Architecture is communication. Most architects don't understand that they're writing sentences. What sentence does this building write? I asked. He looked around the studio, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the clean walls, the quality of the northern light. This room says there is enough space here for serious work. It says whoever works here is trusted with the light. He looked at me. I had it designed that way. Me, I said. Whoever was right for the project. You already knew that was me. A pause. The honest kind. Yes, he said. I looked at him for a moment. You know that's still strange, right? That you designed a studio for a specific person before you technically met them. I'm aware it falls outside normal parameters. Normal parameters, I repeated. You make it sound like a deviation in a spreadsheet. Something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. I process most things through frameworks, he said. It's more reliable than instinct. Except when it isn't. He looked at me. The almost smile was still there. Except when it isn't. These were the moments I catalogued without meaning to, the ones where the controlled surface gave slightly and something underneath showed through, not vulnerably but honestly, the difference between a man performing himself and a man briefly being himself. They were short. They always closed again. But they were accumulating, the way a collection accumulates, and I'd stopped pretending I wasn't collecting them. The party was Marcus Varden's idea. Marcus Varden was a Kane Capital board member who had apparently decided that the best way to celebrate the midpoint of the Kane Tower renovation project was a black tie event at his townhouse on the Upper East Side, which meant that I, as the project's commissioned artist, increasingly visible in Adrian's professional orbit, received an invitation embossed on cream cardstock that smelled faintly of something expensive. Nora delivered it with the expression she wore when she was conveying information she'd been asked to convey without editorializing. Mr. Varden's events tend to run late, she said, and Mr. Varden tends to ask intrusive questions. You don't have to answer them. This a warning? I asked. It's context, she said. Nora had been different with me since the photographs. Not warmer, exactly. Nora operated at a consistent temperature that I suspected was part of her professional identity, but more present. The careful neutrality she maintained toward me had developed a small seam of something that might, in another person, have been called protectiveness. She had started appearing at my studio door around lunchtime with updates that could have been emailed, and I had started understanding that the updates were not the point. Nora, I said one afternoon after she'd lingered past the point where the update required lingering, did you leave the folder open on purpose? The pause she took was exactly 1 second. Have a great deal of correspondence to manage, she said. I can't always keep track of every document on my desk. Right, I said. Varden party, she said. You should wear something that makes you feel powerful, not just good, powerful. She left before I could respond. The Varden townhouse was 5 floors of gilded excess on East 73rd, the kind of home that had been built to host parties and had never stopped. There were perhaps 40 people when I arrived, swelling to 60 by 9 o'clock, a curated gathering of old money and new power in roughly equal measure, the women in gowns that announced their provenance, the men in suits that announced their confidence. I wore dark green. Silk. I had found it at a consignment shop in the village the previous spring, and saved it for an occasion worthy of it, and I walked into the Varden townhouse in it with the particular feeling of wearing armor that also happens to be beautiful. Adrian was already there. He was standing near the fireplace, speaking to 2 men I didn't recognize, and he saw me come in. It was a look I felt before I processed it, the specific quality of being seen by someone who has been waiting for the sight of you, who has arranged their attention in advance, so that the moment of arrival lands in prepared ground. His gaze moved over me once, quickly and completely, and then came back to my face with an expression that he controlled immediately, but not quite fast enough. Not fast enough. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I moved toward the bar with the measured confidence I'd spent 4 years practicing, and ordered something cold and dry, and went to work on the room. Marcus Varden was 60, broad, with the particular bonhomie of powerful men who have decided that charm is more useful than intimidation in most social contexts. He found me within 15 minutes of my arrival, which I suspected was not an accident. "Artist," he said, with the warmth of someone saying the prize. Adrian's been remarkably quiet about this commission, which means it's either extraordinary or disastrous. With Adrian, there's rarely a middle ground. "I hope for the former," I said. "Long have you known him?" Varden asked. "Adrian, you seem comfortable with each other. I noticed it last time at the board dinner." 7 weeks, I said. Varden's eyes moved toward Adrian across the room, then back to me with an expression I couldn't read. 7 weeks, he repeated. "That's fast for Adrian." He doesn't usually let people in that quickly. "I'm not sure I'd describe our professional relationship as..." "Of course," Varden said smoothly, with the smile of someone who has just communicated something by appearing not to. "Professional, quite right." He moved away. I stared at the space he'd vacated and thought about the word usually and what it implied about the people who came before, and about Alina with her red paintbrush and her disappeared name. "He's testing you," a voice said beside me. I turned. The woman was perhaps 50, sharp-featured, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggests a person has stopped softening their assessments for anyone's comfort. "Varden," she continued. "He tests everyone in Adrian's orbit. It's sport for him. You are Deanna Reeves. I'm on the board. I'm also, or have been, the closest thing Adrian has to an honest friend." She said it without warmth or its absence, the simple statement of a fact. "He doesn't have many." "You should know that going in." "Going into what?" I asked. Deanna looked at me with the calm patience of someone waiting for a slower student to catch up. "Whatever this is," she said. I opened my mouth. She spoke first. "Tell me it's professional. I've known Adrian for 14 years. I know every register of his attention. What I saw when you walked through that door is not professional." Fire crackled in the grate between us. "He's complicated," she said. "More than people know, and people know quite a bit. He's been carrying something for a long time. I won't tell you what it is because it's not mine to tell. But I'll tell you this, the last woman who was important to him." She stopped. Something moved across her face. "It didn't end well, for reasons that were not simple and not entirely his fault and not entirely not his fault." "Alina," I said. Deanna's expression shifted. A single, controlled recalibration. She looked at me with something sharper than assessment, something closer to concern. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked. I found a photograph. "In the studio." Deanna was quiet for a moment. Then, "Be careful," she said. "Not because he's dangerous the way people assume, but because he's dangerous in the way that really matters, the kind that doesn't look like danger until it's already inside." She moved away. I stood by the fire and held my drink and thought about the locked floor and the figure in the window and the name that no Google search could find, and I thought about carrying something. And I thought about, what? Chapter 4, What Proximity Does to Air Violet. The VARDEN party. Latter found me at 10:30. On the second-floor balcony where I'd retreated after an hour of conversation that had left me overstimulated and undernourished in the way that parties in expensive rooms sometimes do. Plenty of words, very little said. The balcony overlooked the townhouse garden, bare and geometric in the November dark, and the city beyond it carried its nighttime noise like a constant low tide. I had my coat draped over my shoulders and my drink in my hand, and I was looking at the garden and thinking about Diana Reeves and what she'd said, and then I heard the door and turned, and he was there. He came to stand beside me at the railing. He'd lost the jacket at some point, unusual for him, who maintained his professional presentation with what I'd come to understand was a kind of discipline that also functioned as armor. He was in his shirt sleeves, the collar unbuttoned at the throat, and he looked different. Not undone, but less composed. The difference between a controlled thing and a resting thing. We stood for a moment in silence. Below us the garden was silver and still. "Diana Reeves spoke to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "She did. What did she say?" "That you're complicated, that you've been carrying something." I paused. "That the last woman who was important to you had a story that didn't end well." He was quiet. His hands were on the railing, and I watched them, the only part of him that sometimes showed what his face didn't, a slight tension in the knuckles when something cost him. She's not wrong, he said. About which part? Any of it. Garden was quiet below us. Somewhere inside the party murmured on, the sound of it muffled and warm through the glass doors. Tell me about her, I said. Elena! His jaw tightened, I saw it. Tonight, he said. Then when, a long pause. When I can say it correctly. What does that mean? He turned to look at me, and in the dark of the balcony, his face was doing the thing it rarely did, showing the texture underneath the surface, the complicated geography of someone who has kept things down for so long that the effort of keeping them shows more than the things themselves. It means, he said, that there are things I need to be able to say in a way that is true, and I haven't found the language yet. I looked at him. Take your time, I said. I'm a good listener. Something moved across his face, too fast to name, too real to dismiss. He turned back toward the garden. Cold, he said. Fine, you're shivering. I looked down. I was slightly. The November air had done what November air does, and my coat over shoulders arrangement was decorative rather than functional. He reached over without asking and adjusted the coat, settling it properly around my shoulders, his hands brief and careful at the collar, and the contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds and was entirely practical, and I was aware of it for the next 3 hours. He stepped back, exactly back to where he'd been standing, the precise distance maintained. We should go back in, he said. Probably, I said. Neither of us moved for another minute. Then he opened the door and held it, and I walked past him into the warmth of the party, and I was very careful not to let my expression do anything that would give me information I wasn't ready to have. He drove me home. I hadn't expected it. I'd been collecting my coat from the attendant near the entrance when he appeared beside me, already in his overcoat, and said, "My car is outside," in the tone of someone offering a ride rather than suggesting one. I said yes because it was raining, and because the alternative required pretending I had a strong preference for a cab, which I didn't. The car was a black sedan with a privacy partition behind the driver, a detail I noticed and filed without examining. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something subtle, and the city moved past the windows in the particular way it moves when you're sealed away from its sound, like watching a film on mute. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. The silence between us had changed since the photographs. It was less careful now, less professionally maintained. More like the silence of people who are thinking about the same thing and haven't decided to say it yet. Varden said something to you, Adrian said. I watched him, he was testing for a reaction. Asked how long I'd known you. I paused. He seemed interested in the answer. He's interested in everything that might give him leverage, Adrian said, in the same even tone he used for weather reports. It's how he operates. Leverage over you. Leverage in general. It's not personal. Anything with the people in your world. He looked at me. In the moving light of the city through the window, his face was all shadow and edge, and the look he gave me had a quality I'd stopped trying to categorize. Some things are, he said. We stopped outside my building, the ordinary Brooklyn brownstone that existed in a different solar system from the Kane Tower atrium, from Varden townhouses, from penthouses above the city. I reached for the door handle. Violet. My name in his voice. He used it rarely. It was almost always Miss Hayes, the professional distance maintained in a single word. When he used my first name, it was always significant, always the sign of something pushing through the careful management. I stopped. Turned. He was looking at me with an expression that was the most unguarded I'd seen from him, something open and difficult, the face of a man who has arrived at the edge of something and is deciding whether to step. Things I've done, the research, the meeting, the way I brought you into this, he paused. I want you to know that none of it was careless. Everything I've done has been deliberate. That's not exactly reassuring, I said. I know, he said. But I'd rather you understand that this is considered than believe it's casual. You are not casual. He held my gaze. To me, you are not casual to me. City moved quietly around us. The rain on the roof of the car, the driver patient behind his partition. I looked at Adrian Kane and understood with the clarity that sometimes comes when you stop arguing with a truth that I was in a great deal of trouble. Good night, Adrian, I said. Good night, he said. I got out. I walked up the steps of my building without looking back. I made it through my front door, up 3 flights, into my apartment, and across to the window before I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Outside, the rain fell on Brooklyn. Across the river, somewhere 53 floors up, the light in a penthouse window was probably still on. I thought about you are not casual to me. I thought about it for a long time. Chapter 5, the door that shouldn't open. Violet. The following MONDAY found the access card on Wednesday morning, tucked inside the cover of one of my sketchbooks. Not hidden. Not left accidentally. Placed with the deliberate placement of someone who has made a decision and is enacting it in the quietest way available to them, leaving the choice to the recipient. It was a key card. Building standard in format, matte black, with no marking except a small embossed number in the lower right corner. 17. I held it in my hand for a long time. I thought about Nora's voice. I'd put that away if I were you. I thought about Diana Reeves carrying something. I thought about the figure in the window and the photographs that didn't exist in any Google search and a woman named Alina who had stood at these windows before me and then ceased to exist in any searchable record. I thought about what Adrian had said in the car. Everything I've done has been deliberate. This was deliberate too. The card in my sketchbook, the invitation without words, the choice left to me. I thought for 7 minutes. Then I went to the elevator. The 17th floor was not storage. I understood that the moment the elevator doors opened, and I stepped into a corridor that smelled of climate-controlled air and something else, faint, organic, the smell of materials preserved, and saw that the walls were not the utilitarian gray of building infrastructure but the same warm plaster as my studio, the same quality of finish. The corridor was short. One door at the end, heavy and unmarked. I walked to it, pressed the card to the panel. The lock released with a soft click that sounded enormous in the silence. I pushed the door open. The room was perhaps the same size as my studio, but configured differently, lower work tables, shelving along 3 walls, and in the center, arranged with the care of a gallery installation, a series of architectural models. 10, 12 of them. Buildings in various stages of design, some complete down to miniature interiors, others skeletal, showing only structure. All hand-built, the work of someone who built models the way other people build their understanding of the world, from the inside out. But it was the wall that stopped me. The far wall, floor to ceiling, perhaps 6 meters wide, was covered. Not decorated. Covered. Photographs, blueprints, handwritten notes, swatches of material, all assembled with the dense, interconnected logic of a mind working something out over a long period of time. Lines of string in 3 colors, red, white, blue, connected documents across the surface in a map of relationships I couldn't yet read. At the center of the wall, a building I didn't recognize. Not Kane Tower. Something older, a low, sprawling structure with the particular proportions of something designed in a previous era, photographed at multiple angles and in multiple seasons. Beside it, handwriting I recognized now as Adrian's, small and precise, completed 1987. M.W. Kane, architect, M.W. Kane. His mother. I moved closer. The handwritten notes were dense, accumulative, years of additions in slightly different inks, the record of someone returning to the same question over a long period of time. I could read fragments, structural survey 2019, contested, see file 7, and demolition stay extended through Q3, and permission to access refused, legal avenue exhausted. And at the bottom in fresher ink, underlined twice, violet haze, what we left in the rooms. Salvage methodology, see this, my name, my work, in the center of whatever this was. I should have shown you this sooner. Voice was from the doorway behind me. I didn't flinch. I'd heard the elevator faintly 30 seconds ago and some part of me had understood. I turned. Adrian stood in the door with the expression of a man who has opened something that can't be closed again and has decided after a long time that this was the right choice. What is this room? I asked. He came in. He stood beside me, looking at the wall with an expression that was stripped of the usual management, showing something that was not quite pain and not quite resolve but lived in the territory of both. My mother's building, he said. The crest. She designed it in 1985. It's in upstate New York, was her masterwork, the thing she considered her best. She used reclaimed materials almost exclusively. Every beam, every window, every surface had a history. He paused. She died when I was 19, a week before she was going to submit the plans for its renovation. The building has been in a legal dispute since then. Her estate, the foundation that owns the property, a developer who wants to demolish it and build something new. You've been trying to save it, I said. For 15 years, he said. Every legal avenue, every financial mechanism, every argument. He looked at the wall. The demolition order was granted 3 months ago. The building is scheduled to come down in the spring. The timeline of my commission. The 6 months. Adrian, I said slowly, what did you actually hire me to do? He looked at me. His face, in the quiet of that room, was the most honest it had ever been, the careful architecture fully laid aside, the man underneath exposed in the way that only happens when something has been held for too long to hold anymore. Things, he said. The atrium installation, which is real. I wanted to understand if what you do, salvage, reclamation, making new things from the materials of what's been destroyed, if there was a way to apply that to the crest. If someone with your specific understanding could find a way to document it, preserve its materials, its DNA, before the demolition. He paused. I didn't know how to ask directly. Asking directly would have been honest, I said. And you don't know how to do that. A beat. Learning, he said. I looked at the wall. At the building his mother had made, photographed in all seasons, surrounded by 15 years of a son's effort to save it. At my own name, written in his hand, connected by a line of red string to the photograph at the center. Show me the building, I said. He looked at me. Take me to see it, I said. Before the spring, let me see what we're dealing with. Something moved across his face that I recognized now, the thing that happened when he was moved and was deciding whether to show it. This time, he let it show. This weekend, he said. If you're willing. Willing, I said. We stood in the room his mother's building had made of him for a long moment, and the city was far away, and the wall with its 15 years of persistence surrounded us. And I understood, standing there, that I hadn't been hired for an installation. I'd been hired because Adrian Kane, who controlled everything, who engineered outcomes, who played only games he'd already won, had found one thing in 15 years that he couldn't win alone. And he had watched me, and researched me, and arranged an elevator malfunction, and given me a studio with perfect light, and waited 7 weeks and a confession and a key card in a sketchbook, because he needed help. And because I understood this now, with the particular clarity of a thing that's been true for some time before you see it, he needed it from me specifically. The question I hadn't answered yet was whether I was going to let that matter. Chapter 6, The Road North Violet, Saturday morning, drove himself. This was the first surprise. I'd expected the black sedan, the silent driver, the privacy partition. Instead, at 7:15 on a Saturday morning, a car I'd never seen pulled up to my building, darker gray, lower to the ground, the kind of car designed for someone who actually drives rather than someone who is driven. And Adrian was behind the wheel in dark jeans, and a coat I'd never seen him in, and an expression that was different from every expression I'd cataloged in 8 weeks. He looked, I thought, almost like a person, not the billionaire, not the controlled professional, not the man whose presence reorganized the air in every room he entered. Just a man in a gray coat on a Saturday morning who'd offered to show me something important and was waiting to see if I'd come. I came down with my bag and my sketchbooks and the coffee I'd made because I'd been awake since 5:30 and needed it, and I got into the car, and he said good morning in a voice that was quieter than his usual register, and I said good morning back, and we drove north out of the city into the pale November morning. We talked for the first hour. Not about the building, about other things, the kind of conversation that happens when 2 people have been circling each other in a professional context and suddenly have 3 hours in a car together, and the professional context has receded. He told me about growing up in the city, not the parts I'd have expected, not the wealth or the achievement, but the parts that formed before the wealth, a childhood that was complicated in ways he didn't specify but gestured at, a mother who was brilliant and present, and then, when he was 19, not. I told him about Ohio, about the specific quality of wanting something you can't name in a place that has a name for everything it considers worthwhile and nothing for the thing you're after. About leaving at 18 with a scholarship and a duffel bag and the feeling of a life finally starting. Did you look back? He asked. Once, I said. From the bus, and then I didn't. He was quiet for a moment. I've never left, he said. New York, I've traveled, but I've never left in the way you mean. What would it take? I asked. He considered this seriously, which was how he considered everything. Something worth more than the staying, he said. We drove through towns that got smaller as we went, the city falling away in layers, the suburbs, the exurbs, the stretches of land between that had no category except in between. And at some point the conversation became silence, but it was the easy kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The crest appeared at the end of a long private road, bare November trees on either side making an avenue of it, and I saw it before Adrian said anything. The word that came to me was alive. Which was strange because it had been empty for 15 years, and the evidence of 15 years of emptiness was visible in the way of old houses. The vines that had found the stone, the windows dusty and darkened, the grounds returned to their own preferences. But the building itself had a quality that I recognized immediately and understood with the specific knowledge of someone who works with old materials. The quality of something built with intention, so deep it outlasts the builder. His mother's handwriting was all over it. I could see her in the proportions, the low, generous roof lines that refused to reach for height, the windows placed for light rather than symmetry, the way the building settled into the land rather than imposing on it. Every decision was a conversation with the landscape rather than an argument with it. Adrian parked and got out and stood looking at it for a moment with an expression I didn't try to read. Then he walked toward the front entrance, and I followed. Inside, the cold of long vacancy had accumulated in the rooms, and the light through the dusty windows was thick and golden and specific. Exactly the kind of light I'd been working with in my studio, the salvaged, layered light of old glass. The floors were white oak, very dark, marked with the record of decades of use. The walls showed the structure beneath the finish. Here a beam, there a lintel, everywhere the evidence of a builder who considered beauty and function the same conversation. We moved through the rooms in silence, and I looked at everything with the focused attention I used in the studio, not aesthetically but materially, reading what the building was made of, understanding what it had been and what it still was. Adrian walked with me, not directing, not explaining. Letting me look in a large room at the back of the house, the kind of room that wants to be a studio, with a wall of windows looking into the winter trees. I stopped. The windows were floor to ceiling, the same configuration as my studio in Kane Tower. The glass was old pre-war with the slight waviness I recognized. The light that came through it scattered the way I'd spent 8 weeks trying to understand, scattered and gathered, and did something with the afternoon that was unrepeatable in new glass. She specified the glass, Adrian said from behind me. She sourced it from a demolished building in the city. A school, actually. I turned. He was standing in the doorway of the room, looking at me with an expression that had no control left in it. None. Just the thing underneath, unmanaged, enormous, the face of a person in the presence of two things they love in the same moment. I looked at the windows, at the light, at the glass that his mother had salvaged from a demolished school, the exact material I worked with, the exact source, the exact principle. She would have loved your work, he said. What we left in the rooms. A pause. She called it the same thing, not a title, just the way she thought about it. That rooms are not empty when the people leave them, that the material holds something. Light moved through the old glass, below us, outside the windows. The November trees held their bare branches against a sky the color of pewter. I thought, you brought me here because I am the closest living thing to her way of seeing. I thought, you are not looking at me. You are looking at something I remind you of. I thought, that should be disturbing. It should make me feel like a replacement or a prop. It should make me feel used. I thought, it doesn't. We can save the materials, I said. If they demolish it, we document everything first. Every beam, every window, every original surface. We create a record. And then we use the materials, the actual physical materials from this building, in the Kane Tower installation. He stared at me. Atrium installation, I said. We make it from her building. The glass, the wood, the stone if it's workable. We bring the crest into the center of Kane Tower. She built with salvage, we salvage her. Silence in the room was the kind that happens when something true has been said that can't be unsaid. Adrian Kane, who controlled everything, who engineered outcomes, who had spent 15 years fighting a battle with every weapon available to him and losing, stood in the doorway of his mother's room with the late November light coming through her windows, and the look on his face was the most undefended thing I had ever seen a person allow another person to witness. He turned away. I let him. Some things need a moment with no one watching. I turned back to the windows and looked at the trees, and the light moved through the old glass, and somewhere in the space between what I'd come here to do and what I was actually doing, something shifted. The last thing I'd been holding at a careful professional distance fell, quietly and completely, into a different category altogether. The drive back to the city was quiet, not uncomfortably. The quiet of two people who have understood something new about each other and are deciding what to do with it. At the entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge, he said, "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for showing me," I said, and then, after a pause, "I'm going to need access to the building again, multiple visits to do the documentation properly." "Whatever you need," he said. "Need you there," I said. "You know it better than anyone. I'll need you to tell me what things meant to her." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. I looked out the window at the bridge rising over the water, the city spreading beyond it, the 10,000 lights coming on in the early dark. We were inside something now, the two of us. Something with dimensions I couldn't yet measure, boundaries I hadn't located. Something that had started with a wrong floor and photographs and an engineered collision, and had arrived, by way of a key card and a sketchbook and a room full of old glass and a man turning away because he needed a moment with no one watching here. Here was not a place I'd planned to be. Here was, I suspected, exactly where I was supposed to be. The bridge lights reflected off the river below us, moving with the water, and I thought, salvage, making new things from what's been broken. What remains after the demolition? I thought, this is what we left in the rooms. Chapter 7, What I Don't Say. Adrian, same night, the penthouses stood at the window for a long time after he got home. This was not unusual. He stood at the window most nights, the city below a system he was responsible for understanding, the lights a map of other people's lives that he could look at without being required to enter. He'd always found comfort in altitude, distance. The management of proximity through architecture. Tonight the window gave him nothing. He poured a drink and didn't drink it, the way he often didn't drink the drink he poured, the ritual of it the thing rather than the substance. He thought about the room with the old windows, about the light. About Violet standing in it with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything. Not the studied attention of someone performing interest, but the real thing, the focus of a person whose relationship with the material world was direct and intimate and entirely without performance. He thought about what she'd said. "We make it from her building. 15 years. 15 years of legal fights and financial strategies and every available mechanism, and in 20 minutes in a cold room in November, she'd found the thing he hadn't been able to find. Not how to save it, but what to do when you couldn't. How to carry what you couldn't preserve." He set the drink down. The problem, and he'd been aware of it for weeks, cataloging it with the same systematic attention he brought to problems that carried risk, was the following. Violet Hayes was inside his defenses. Not through the gaps, through the front door. He had opened the front door. He had put a key card in her sketchbook and driven her 3 hours north and stood in the doorway of his mother's room and let her see his face. He had never done that. Not with anyone. Not after Alina, and that was a different story, one he hadn't told yet, one that lived in a room of its own inside him, and he would have to tell it eventually, and the telling would be the hardest thing. The problem with Violet was not that he'd let her in. The problem was that he wanted to let her in further. He was aware of what this meant. He was aware of his own history with wanting, the way he wanted things with a totality that other people found alarming, the way his wanting had edges that could cut, had weight that could press, had the particular quality of intensity that was, in smaller doses, what made him effective, and in larger doses, what had cost him the things that mattered most. He knew what he was. He had catalogued himself as carefully as he catalogued everything else, with the same dispassionate precision, and what the catalogue showed was a man who did not do anything halfway, who could not be moderate about the things that mattered to him, who had learned to keep the things that mattered to a very small number because the alternative was damage. Violet Hayes mattered. She had mattered since March, since 11 minutes in front of a piece of glass and salvaged windows and a title that said everything his mother had ever believed about the world. She had mattered before he'd said a word to her, which was the kind of mattering he didn't have a precedent for, which was why he'd engineered the collision rather than simply introducing himself, because he'd known, with the below-conscious certainty that bypassed deliberation, that the introduction wouldn't have been sufficient. That whatever he felt standing in front of her work in March required context, required time, required the slow construction of something that could bear the weight he was going to put on it. He was aware this was not rational. He was also aware that it was true. He turned from the window, moved to the desk, opened the file he'd never fully closed, the one that had started with a gallery visit and accumulated over months into something he'd been unwilling to name. At the top of the file, the photograph of what we left in the rooms, taken the day he'd seen it in March. The glass fragments. The light. The title card. He closed the file. He had one more thing to do before he could allow what was happening to happen. One story he had to tell. One room he had to open. Alina's room, floor 17. He'd been avoiding it for 8 weeks, avoiding the conversation, avoiding the disclosure, telling himself it was about timing and language and finding the words that were true. All of that was real, but underneath it was the simpler truth. He was afraid of what she would do when she knew. Whether what was building between them could survive what he had to tell her, whether he deserved it to. He stood in the center of his penthouse, 53 floors above the city, and the city made its nighttime sounds, and he thought, tell her before it goes further. Tell her before the further point makes the telling catastrophic. Tell her because she is the first person in 15 years who has made the silence feel like something other than safety. He picked up his phone. Set it back down. Too late for a call. Too soon for a message. Tomorrow. He would tell her tomorrow. He went to bed. He didn't sleep. In the room on the 17th floor, undisturbed, the light was on. It was always on. That was the secret he hadn't told her yet. The one that would change everything. End of part 2. Cliffhanger. She went to floor 17 herself. Not because he'd invited her. Not because he'd left another key card. Because the card from Wednesday still worked. She'd checked at midnight, alone in the elevator. And because the light under the door was the kind of light that doesn't come from an automated system. It was the light of a room that is inhabited. She pressed the card to the panel. The door opened. The woman inside turned around. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired. A brush in her hand, loaded with cadmium red. The exact woman from the photograph. Alina was not gone. Alina had never left. Alina was living in Adrian Kane's building.